A little over a year ago, I finished renovating this bathroom, transforming it from old and grody to modern and clean. By finished, what I mean is I got it done enough that you could use the toilet and the shower. It took my wife the better part of the last year to convince me it was time to get the sink up and running so we could stop washing our hands in the bathtub. In my last project video, I built a cherry base, complete with hidden toe kick storage. Now in this one, I'm going to show you the entire process it took to make a gorgeous fake stone countertop out of some cheap MDF and some epoxy. The first thing we have to do is make a basic countertop that the epoxy will be poured onto later. MDF is the most stable material you can use for this, as long as you do a good job of completely sealing it, but we'll get into that a little more later. I used a track saw and a table saw to cut the exact size of my vanity top out of a full 3/4 inch thick sheet. We are using an undermount sink in this project, which came with a paper template to help make the hole the correct size. But because I'm spoiled, I used my laser to make a better template. The opening I cut in this 1/4 inch plywood is square with the outside edges, which makes it easy to line up square with the countertop. From here, I just traced the hole and drew in a bunch of extra alignment lines so I could get the sink positioned perfectly when it comes time to mount it. Once I was happy with the layout, I used a jigsaw to cut out the opening, staying close to, but always inside of the actual line. Now I can just line my template back up, clamp it in place, and use a flush trim bit to make the opening in the MDF match up perfectly with the laser cut template. MDF tends to throw a lot of really fine dust when you shape it, so I did my best to have some dust collection close by. This at least kept the loose dust from getting airborne, then I could come back and clean up the rest of the mess later. With still growing kids in the house, we decided we wanted to favor the front edge as much as we could to make the faucet easier to reach. This meant that the top frame for the vanity was in the way, but some quick work with the jigsaw cleared that right out. Then I could drop the base in place to make sure everything fit just right. A single sheet of MDF would leave me with a counter that looked a little too dainty, but completely doubling the thickness would just be overkill. So the solution is to glue a 1-inch strip along the front edge. While that glue was drying, I grabbed the world's oldest and dullest hole saw and spent the next 27.5 minutes mostly burning my way through the MDF to make a hole for the faucet. After that ordeal, I used an 1/8 inch bit in my trim router to add a slight curve to the underside of the sink and faucet holes. I sanded the front edge to make that seam disappear, then added a slight round over to the bottom edge there as well. Since that tiny lip makes it a bit precarious to balance the router, I butted a piece of scrap up to it to make things more stable. I flipped the MDF over and added a 1/4 inch round over on this side. The profile on top looks nice, but it's also crucial in helping the epoxy flow around the edges. A sharp edge would result in an MDF corner poking through between the epoxy on top and the front face. One last little detail here is that my sink basin will be attached by using threaded inserts embedded in the underside of the countertop, and the instructions insist that the material needs to be at least 1 inch thick. So I glued on some strategically shaped bits of 1/4 inch MDF in the corners where these inserts would be added later on. So here's the epoxy we will be using. This is a kit from Stone Coat that comes with everything you need to make a countertop that looks like marble. Before we get to mixing the actual epoxy, we need to use this undercoating to seal the MDF and give us a bright white base to start with. This is definitely the easy part. Just dump some on, spread it around with a brush or a roller, then wait for it to dry. A quick sanding and a second coat is a good idea to make sure it's completely covered. This stuff is so white, it played havoc on the exposure settings on my camera. Once the undercoat was dry, we put masking tape around all the edges and left it sticking up proud of the surface as a barrier. Eventually, we want the epoxy to roll off over the edges, but at first we needed to hold it back while we work on the design. After some very careful calculations, we poured out part B, then added part A, and mixed up enough epoxy to cover our countertop. After a thorough mixing, we portioned it out into several different cups to start mixing in colors. Oops, don't worry, honey, I'll cut that part out. Katie wanted a very light, almost white countertop with just some veins of color and sparkles running through it. So we went heavy with the white dye and white metallic pigment powder. We mixed a little of the gray pigment powder for that added color, and just a single drop of black dye. And that single drop would turn out to be the villain of this story. With all the colors mixed separately, we started pouring them a little at a time back into the big bucket we started with. We would pour in a little of this one and then a little of that one. It's important not to mix them at all at this point, but rather to just let them swirl their way into each other and sort of mingle together inside the pot. Every once in a while, we would hit it with a squirt of metallic gray or solid white spray paint. At this time, I want to point out that Stonecoat has a fantastic YouTube channel, and everything I'm trying to explain to you now is something that I learned by watching their videos. They suggested this little spray paint addition in order to help add more depth between the layers and swirls in the finished product. By the time we were done adding all the small cups back to the original, we had this crazy, swirly bucket of goo that was ready to be dumped out and create the most beautiful countertop you could possibly imagine. And that is when tensions started to get high. That single drop of black and little bit of gray metallic made the first pour come out looking like slate with some light highlights in it. And after all our careful calculations, well, it looked like the resulting volume would only cover about half the surface area. At this point, I may have accused Katie of pouring it on too thick, and she may have accused me of not shutting up enough. So I put the camera down and tried helping instead of coaching. Turns out, no amount of tilting and spreading was going to get us the coverage we needed or the light color Katie wanted. So Katie went back and mixed a second batch as big as the first, but this time only used the light colors. And after swirling the colors together in the bucket again, she proceeded to strategically dump it out on the countertop to fill the empty spaces. And now, it looked worse than ever. But since we had long since passed the point of no return, we started pointing out the things we didn't like to each other, dragging our fingers through the goop, and tilting the whole thing around in an effort to Picasso our way to something salvageable. Yes, Picasso can be a verb. We even went back to the small cups and scraped their remnants back into play. This corner needs some more dark streaks. That one needs some more white. We futzed with it for so long that the tape started to give up and the epoxy was spilling over the edges on its own. And you know what? It was actually working. I started using a torch and a heat gun to pop air bubbles and make some of the streaks flow this way or that way. Dragging our fingers through it also helped to make the smears look more like natural curves. Then, when we intentionally pulled the rest of the tape off and the flow of the tide actually pulled the liquid in different directions, the whole horrible, nearly catastrophic mess started to look more organic and honestly, pretty damn cool. In order to help the edges get coated evenly, we would drag our fingers over the dry spots to break the surface tension and cause the flow to continue on its own. With all this epoxy now efficiently running onto the floor, it was a good thing I put a tarp down before we started. And when the puddles on the floor got big enough, I actually scooped it back up into cups, then used it to pour into the cracks in my floor, meaning in the end, very little of the material was actually wasted, and now the wheels on my mobile tools won't get caught in those cracks anymore. When we were finally done messing with it, we walked away for 24 hours to let the epoxy harden. All that dripping left the underside covered in little stalactites that needed to be sanded off, which was easily accomplished with an aggressive sanding disc on my angle grinder. Next, I needed to finish sealing the underside of the countertop because otherwise the MDF would act like a sponge and suck up every bit of moisture that crossed its path, causing it to swell up and warp. To seal it, I just rolled and brushed on a healthy coat of RedGuard. I actually did a few coats because I was trying to finish off the bucket. Katie and I also debated on the proper time to do this sealing. She politely suggested that I do the RedGuard before the epoxy, that way it would roll over the edges and the epoxy would be on top of the RedGuard. Knowing that the stalactites would need to be sanded off, I thought it would be better to do the RedGuard last. That way, if I sanded too aggressively at any point, I could be sure to recoat the exposed MDF, keeping it waterproof. With the RedGuard dry, I drilled holes for the threaded anchors for the sink, then used a small amount of epoxy to glue them in place. Then, with everything relocated to the bathroom, I put a generous bead of silicone around the rim of the sink. I set the sink onto the counter, then installed and tightened the mounting clips. I put a bunch more silicone around the top of the vanity, then flipped the countertop over and mushed it in place. The silicone probably would have been enough, but I also ran a few short screws up from the bottom to lock it down permanently. I installed the faucet, then the drain hardware from underneath. Then I just needed to connect the drain to the pipe in the wall. I tried to do my best impression of a plumber, but with my complete lack of a butt, the crack footage was pretty underwhelming and it didn't make the final edit. One final step was to run a bead of white caulking around the inside of the sink. Not because it needed more waterproofing, but because if you look closely, the sink looks pink because of that RedGuard reflecting off the white surface, and I needed to cover it up. Does that mean Katie was right about the order of operations and I should have done the RedGuard first? I don't honestly know. What do you think? What would you have done? I want to thank Stonecoat for providing the epoxy kit for this project. It turned out incredible. This is the first project where the more I messed with something, the better it turned out. Their step-by-step tutorials told me that's exactly how this is going to play out, so now I know for next time, just trust the process. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe, and if you haven't already, check out my recent vlog-style videos for a more behind-the-scenes look into life here at Gunflint Designs.